Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to this very nice seminar by Jan Stuller. I'm going to introduce Jan in a second. I'm Anna Maria Maida, I'm a professor of economics. I'm visiting Johns Hopkins Science for 1 year, and I come from Georgetown University. So let me say a few words about Jan. Jan Stuller is becoming one of the superstars in the economics literature of migration, and he also works on intergenerational mobility. He received a PhD in economics from University College London, and his advisors were two of the most prolific authors in the economics of migration. So Jan has worked with Kristen Gassman and Ute Schomburg. But when we will, for those of you who will take my class on migration, you'll see these are very important key figures in this literature. Jan is affiliated with PRIAM, CPR, and ICA, and in less than 10 years from his PhD, he has published very well. So a very nice policy-oriented paper, and the title is The Integration of Migrants in the German Labor Market, Evidence over 50 Years.
Yeah, let me start presenting. We have a bit of a technical issue here. There's some feedback. We're not sure where it's coming from. I'm kind of searching my pockets if I have anything, but I don't.
Give me a second.
Yeah. I think this one is fine. I don't think the microphone is on. I mean, now it's fine. Maybe it stopped.
Okay.
Yeah. And otherwise, of course, we can try one of the other ones.
Okay. Let's try.
Let's try with this one. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Thanks for having me here.
Turn it off. Let's try with.
Some of that I need to nice things to say.
Okay, just very close.
It's already on. Okay, great. Okay. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm very happy to present this work here on labor market integration of migrants in Germany. So I'm generally working on, as you said, on migration, topics related to migration. But this is actually the first project where I really focused a lot on the integration experience for migrants themselves. Okay, so hopefully some of this is going to be new to you. It certainly was, some of this was new to me. So this kind of work trying to get really into this topic, trying to understand better what's going on. And because this was sort of the first work I did on this topic, on this particular topic, I really sort of first wanted to get an overview of what's happening. Okay, so this paper is really very much a paper trying to get an overview it's in the title, over the last 50 years, trying to see how well did migrants integrate into the labor market in Germany, how has this changed over time, and so on. Okay, so very much an overview article. So a bit of background, Germany has actually by now become the second most important destination for migrants worldwide. So right after the US, of course, most migrants still go to the United States. But after that, it's Germany. So we have 13 million foreign-born now. As a population share, that's 17%. If you include second-generation migrants, then that's up to 27%. And because there's, of course, a different demographic structure of migrants, if you look at those at young people in Germany, then we're actually reaching a migrant share of about 40%. Okay, so it's like really a large share of the population now is either foreign-born or has foreign-born parents. And so this is clearly a very important issue. And anyone who's reading the news, not only in Germany, but also many other countries, migration and integration of migrants is, of course, a very important issue. In Germany, I think it's fair to say most immigration episodes took the country by surprise. So I will talk a little bit about it. We started with sort of the so-called guest worker period, where we really actively recruited workers from other countries. But then a lot of the other migration waves that happened after that, they happened more as a surprise. And they were often accompanied by kind of controversial debates rather than positive narratives. We talked about that a little bit earlier, that, for example, if you compare the public debate, for example, around migration in the US or in Germany, so it's a bit different. And so one thing that's maybe interesting about Germany is that part of this debate was always a bit negative in Germany. And part of it was negative because people didn't expect migrants to arrive. So the country, in some sense, was not prepared. So there was a reluctance to actually acknowledge that Germany has become what we in German call Einwanderungsland, immigration country, for a long time. I think now kind of we understood it, right? Now it's we understand that Germany has become an important destination, but for a long time that understanding was missing. So what I want to talk about, I want to give you really like a big picture overview of what has happened in terms of integration outcomes in Germany over the last 50 years. So first I'm going to show you some very general pattern, and then I'm going to ask two specific questions. The first is, how predictable are the integration outcomes of different groups, right? So if you have a new group of migrants coming in, is it kind of predictable what's going to happen? To what extent is it predictable based on the knowledge that we have at arrival? And another question I'm going to ask is, did integration outcomes improve over time, right? Is this something that has systematically changed? And if it has changed, maybe do we now know why that's the case? If we have time, sufficient time, so probably not, but maybe we'll talk briefly about, there was this quite dramatic collapse of employment among some immigrant groups in the 1990s. So I want to show you this briefly and talk briefly about why that might be the case. And if we have enough time, at the very end, we can talk a little bit about the recent refugee cohorts. Okay, if you read the news nowadays, of course, it's a lot about, it's about the Ukrainians who came in recently. It's about those who came in around 2015. And so we also have some evidence of that. So the evidence I'm going to show you today is based on what's called the German microcensus. It's like a 1% sample of the population that's been taken very regularly. And so if you ask, how does it differ what I show you today compared to all the other work that's already out there? There is actually a lot of work for that. It's primarily the difference is the data source. So a lot of the work out there uses survey data or, for example, uses administrative data. And so these have different advantages and disadvantages. I think the advantage of our data source is that it's very representative because it's a really random sample of the population in contrast to, for example, the administrative data, which is just those who are working. And it's being taken every couple of years. So you have sort of a very up-to-date picture and a representative picture of what's happening over time, which is, for example, in contrast to survey data such as the GSERP, where you always have to wait for new samples to be taken of new immigrant arrivals. There's one other paper which has a bit of a similar perspective like ours, and that is by Sprengholz and co-authors. And they are very focused on the gendered dimension of integration. Okay, so they very carefully compare men and women and sort of what's the gender differences. Today, I'm completely going to abstract from that. I'm going to very much focus on men. The idea being is that if you're interested in how well people are doing on the labor market, it's a bit easier to interpret what you see for men and for women, because for women, you also have strong cultural difference across groups to what extent they're attached to the labor market. Okay, so that is very interesting and is discussed in this paper, but today we sort of focus on more on working age. So in particular, we're going to focus on first generation men who have foreign nationalities. We're going to consider 36 different cohorts that I'm going to show you in a second by where they came from and when they arrived. And first, I want to show you a bit of evidence on what happens to their employment. What was the employment rate of natives? And I want to show you what were the income over the time that they spent there. So what are these different groups? So I think it's kind of useful for those of you from Germany who will know a lot about it, others maybe not so much. So I think this is one way kind of categorizing these different periods of immigration in Germany. And of course, the most important one in the beginning was the so-called recruitment period, where we tried to get what we call guest workers from other countries. Okay, so the German economy was booming. There were all these factories, manufacturing, mining, and they needed workers. And so we very actively went to other countries, as also some other European countries did, to actively recruit workers. And those workers came, well, they came particularly from Turkey, Yugoslavia, but also from Italy, for example, Spain, many other European countries. Then there was what we call here a consolidation period. So this was a period where there was a lot of family reunification. So where many of these guest workers got their family in. And we continued to have relatively high immigration. Then we had another wave of immigration in the early 90s. And that was, of course, because of the fall of the Iron Curtain. So now we had lots of Eastern Europeans coming into Germany. And then we had sort of this increased East-West integration. And so we had a few other spikes in immigration more recently, of course, in particular around 2015. So-called refugee arrivals around 2015 from Syria and other countries. And of course, most recently after the Russian-Ukrainian war, arrival of Ukrainians. I'm not going to bore you sort of how exactly we do this. There's a slide explaining how we do this, but it is actually pretty straightforward. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So the question here is exactly, so why do we have these, good question, like why do we have these different periods? It's related to sample size. So for some groups, we had many people coming in, for example, from Turkey. And so we can go into a bit more detail. We can distinguish, those who arrived in 67 and those who arrived later. Why for other groups, we have to look at a bit broader. We have to look, for example, here from Northwestern Europe at broader intervals because just sample size is much smaller. Okay, so it's a trade-off between having large enough groups and trying to go in a bit of details. Great. So I want to show you kind of how these integration profiles look like. Here's an example for the arrivals of these guest workers, these so-called guest workers. For example, Italy here, Italians are here, this would be this line. And we plot this by year since migration. So since when are these individuals in Germany? In this case, the very first years are missing because the data doesn't start in the 60s. It starts a little bit later. But you see the general pattern here. If you compare this to natives, which is this thin black line, for these groups, you see that the employment rates were very similar. Okay, so it kind of becomes a bit lower if you go sort of to 25th year since migration. And that's related to age because also the natives, they grow older and then you have some early retirements and so employment rates dip a little bit. But generally for these groups, employment rates are all very high. If you look at some other groups, so these are, for example, immigrants from Turkey, from Yugoslavia, so also so-called guest workers. So their employment profiles happen to look similar in the early period, but then you see that something happened. And so some of these groups, they have this dramatic drop in their employment to the point that the employment rates towards the end of this period is now 20 or even 25 percentage points below the employment rate of similarly aged natives. Okay, so this is something that's one of these sort of case studies I want to mention later on again. It's like what has happened there? Why suddenly are these groups doing so badly? But first, sort of to show you all the evidence, let me show you these profiles for all these different arrival periods. So these were the ones we were looking at. This was kind of the recruitment period. This is the consolidation period. So again, you see that for some groups, they have very high employment rates, but there are quite a few groups that have employment rates that are systematically below the employment rates of natives. And the gaps are often quite large, right? So the gaps are often 10 percentage points, 15 percentage points, 20 percentage points. So large gaps in employment. And by the way, if we would look at something like welfare dependency, this would be mirrored in dependency and welfare. So for these groups, also the dependency in welfare is much higher than the dependency of native workers. These are the 1988-1995 arrivals. So I think here you see nicely kind of these typical integration profiles that we find in many countries. When migrants come in, of course, they first have very low employment rates compared to natives, but then they catch up, they increasingly find employment. And so you get these concave profiles or convergence profiles where immigrants increasingly catch up with natives. problem, of course, what we see here is that in the German context is that for many groups, we have these large gaps remaining. Okay, so yes, they converge to some extent, but they end up at a point where the employment rates are still much, much lower than the employment rate of similarly aged groups. And this is, by the way, very different to the US context, where in the US, the employment rate of migrants is often higher than the employment rate of natives. Okay, so this is a problem that's quite specific to Germany, or maybe more generally to Europe, that we have this fairly low employment rates among migrants. For completion, these are the sort of the most recent cohorts. Of course, we can't follow them since so long, but you kind of see the same patterns, right? That for certain source countries, you have very low employment rates, and they also don't seem to fully converge. Okay, so I think none of this, what I showed you here, none of this is completely new. I think we kind of, if you open the newspaper, of course, some of that is going to be described in the newspaper. I think what is new is like really to have this very comprehensive overview for many different groups, many different arrival periods. And I think one thing that is a bit new is this dramatic drop in employment here for these earlier guest workers. And that's why we want to look at that in a bit more detail later on. Yeah. Yeah.
The literature finds for the United States. And you said that the employment rates in Germany for first-generation migrants are lower than in the US. Do you have a sense of what drives these differences between the two locations?
Yeah, so I think there are, of course, different hypotheses. So this paper is very descriptive. I'm not going to put my money on a particular hypothesis, but some ideas are very clear. One idea is that it might have something to do with the welfare state, that we have a much more generous welfare state in many European countries compared to the US. So in some sense, in the US, you're being forced to find work. Otherwise, as a migrant, you will have greater problems. And maybe this is not so much not true to the same extent in Germany or other European countries. So it's of course a well-known problem. There's sort of this trade-off between when we design welfare systems, there's this trade-off between trying to help individuals who are in difficult situations. So you want to provide welfare, particularly, of course, to the poorest and those who struggle. On the other hand, you're worried about the disincentive effects. You're worried about that these kind of benefits disincentivize work. And so this is a kind of obvious hypothesis that this might play a role. The second, I think, with this bit more specific potential explanation is that I think some of these groups were very unlucky in which industry they ended up in. So, for example, many of these guest workers, they ended up in manufacturing, they ended up, for example, in mining. And initially that was great because these are industries that are paying relatively well, and they did relatively well. But then in the early 90s, so kind of this story taking away some of what we're going to see later on, in the early 90s, being in those industries was very bad. And so some of what we see here is basically immigrants being in the wrong industry at the wrong time. And an interesting question is, why didn't they recover? Right? So it's very clear what happened to them as in terms of like a shock. So that, for example, many Turkish workers lost their job in the early 90s because, for example, the mining industry did very badly. The question, of course, the follow-up question is, why didn't they find out? Right, and we'll come back to that later on. Yeah.
As a follow-up to this question, there is evidence for the US that there is quite a lot of mobility, internal mobility of migrants. So migrants tend to react quite a lot to economic shocks.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence on that for Germany?
So we know that, of course, generally mobility is lower in Germany in terms of spatial mobility. That's one of the things that we know, that in the US workers are more mobile. They are maybe more actively seeking opportunities. And that's indeed one question is, of course, why did migrants stay in these communities, in these areas with these heavy industries that were depressed? And they're still depressed to some extent in these places. Yeah, I don't know the answer. One hypothesis could, of course, be that this has something to do with networks. You want to stay in your community. Some of these communities are very clustered. Yeah. Great. exactly. And that was the original idea, right? For those who maybe don't know this kind of historical context of this guest worker period, the idea really when they designed these bilateral agreements with sending countries was, okay, we're going to get some of your workers, they come for a couple of years and then they're going to go home. And that's, of course, not what happened, right? Those workers stayed. And I think that's part of the explanation of what we, for example, this period, this consolidation period, this was very much a period where the guest workers did not go home, but instead they got their families in. So this is kind of when people realized, okay, now this guest worker thing is going to work out very differently than we intended. And I think this is also the explanation for these type of patterns that we see here. Is so some of these guest workers in the early 90s, they started losing their jobs. And one response, of course, could have been to say, okay, why don't I go back to my home country, right? And we show in a companion paper, well, my co-author shows in a companion paper that, for example, for the Spanish and the Italian migrants, this is what happened. They were also affected by these closing of industries in the early 90s, but then many of them went back home. And that's why they don't show up as low employment here. So for example, if you look at the Italians, you don't see any decline in the employment rate. That's because many went home. Those who, while for the Turkish, they were affected by job loss, and they didn't work. They didn't go home. They stayed in Germany. Partly, perhaps, because economic conditions were not great in Turkey at that time, and that must have played a role. Yeah. Yeah. You asked about skills or about skills, you said, no? If there was a mismatch in terms of skills. Yeah, I think in particular for the group of Turkish migrants, one hypothesis we were really interested in is that this might have something to do with language. So the idea is that, so first of all, it's much harder for immigrants from Turkey to learn the German language. And they worked in these industries where language was not that important, right? If you work in a factory, if you work in manufacturing, heavy industries, you work on certain machines, and if you understand how the machine works, that's maybe sufficient. So we think, as a hypothesis, and we are not the only ones, there are also other papers, that the Turkish community in particular, they were in big trouble because when they lost their job in these industries where language that was not so important, they should have found jobs in other industries, but the lack of language skills, maybe also coupled with the fact that they were very clustered in their communities, which is, of course, not fostering learning the German language, that this must have really hurt them. Okay, but in this paper, we don't really have direct evidence of that. That's just a plausible interpretation. Okay, so I showed you what happened to employment. Let me summarize what we see. So often these employment profiles are concave, low employment at arrival, but then increasing employment over time. So it's kind of very standard. We see that in other countries. But what's specific here in Germany is that for many of these groups, they keep having substantially lower employment rates than the natives. So if you wonder what is sort of the average gap, so if you average across all migrants, the gap in employment rates to native workers after one decade is 10 percentage points. So that is quite sizable, but of course there's a lot of heterogeneity in groups. So for those groups who have large gaps at arrival, the gaps never close. You saw that here, right? That we see for these groups here, I mean, we only have them for 20 years, but this doesn't look as if these gaps are going to close anytime soon. And one thing that maybe was not so obvious from those graphs, but I can show you in another graph that we have over here. So this is kind of looking at these averages, either unconditional, so really just comparing migrants and natives, or conditional, where conditional means conditional on education. Okay, so the conditional graph here, we look at individuals who have the same education, natives and migrants. And so these are kind of these average gaps that I was talking about, the blue line. Some of that, oh, it's a touch screen. Some of that, of course, is explained by difference in education between migrants and natives. And so I wanted to show you this here. Here you have average employment profiles relative to natives, so the gaps relative to natives, for different immigrant groups that either come from EU countries or immigrant groups that have a high share of refugees or low share of refugees. Okay, it's kind of like just an interesting way of splitting up the data. And so what you see is that, and again, this is not something, you know, completely new. We see similar patterns in other papers, is that immigrant groups that come in as refugees, they of course do worse early on at arrival. Okay, so they don't migrate into a job. They often have to flee their country very rapidly. And so they don't do so well in the first years, maybe not surprisingly. But if you look at the very long run, so after 15, 20 years, I think what's interesting is they catch up with the other groups. Okay, so it takes them much longer. It takes refugees much longer to integrate in the labor market, but they might end up at the same place as non-refugees, okay, on average. Of course, it depends on many other things, but the integration process for them simply takes longer. And finally, I think one interesting observation that for some cohorts, we saw that the gaps actually worsening again over time, right? So some groups did relatively well, actually full conversions to natives, and then something happened, which is maybe also a kind of interesting warning for policymakers. Integration is not necessarily a one-way street. So even groups that look like they're doing well on the labor market, they can still be much more vulnerable to economic shocks than natives. Okay, and that's one of the patterns we see over here. Okay, so we could do the same for income, but I don't want to lose too much time, so I'm just going to show you one graph for income. So these are these earliest arrival cohorts, the guest workers. And so it's the same type of graph, but now the y-axis is real personal income, monthly income. And so again, the black line are the natives, and then you have the different immigrant groups. And well, there's kind of these outliers. These are the Northwest Europeans. They do better than the natives. But one thing that I found striking is how similar all the other immigrant groups are, right? If you remember for employment, there was a lot of variation, right? If you look at these plots, they often look like that, as you know, some groups do better than others. But for income, there's very little variation. Basically, almost all immigrant groups have substantially lower incomes than natives. What I think is also striking is that there's no convergence. So typically we would expect that immigrants, at least to some extent, catch up over time with natives. And in employment, we see that, right? We see that for most groups that they do catch up to some extent. But in income, we instead see divergence. The gaps are becoming larger over time. Why is that? Well, part of the story here is, of course, that the natives have higher education, and more highly educated individuals tend to have higher earning growth, okay? Which perhaps good news for everyone sitting here. Okay, so this kind of the idea that if you have, let's say, a master's degree or some higher education, you will tend to have higher income growth. Right, exactly. Why exactly? What could explain this? I mean, there are many mechanisms. One is more compositional, it's difference in education, but then conditional. We see these divergence, even conditional education. So let me show you this graph. The blue line is just comparing natives and immigrants that have similar age. The orange line is controlling for education. So now we are looking at migrants and natives who have a comparable education, and we still see this divergence. So, you know, even if you compare a native and an immigrant who, let's say, both have a high school degree, their incomes will tend to diverge over time. Okay, so discrimination could be one story. I think what's probably part of the story is that also right at the beginning, migrants tend to sort into the worst jobs, okay? And tend to sort into worst jobs, not in terms of current pay, but also in terms of career potential. And yeah, so we don't go deeper in this paper, but this will be interesting to study further. Okay, this I already said. So this was kind of just giving you like a very broad overview to what happened to the first generation. Let me show you very briefly what happened to the second generation. Okay, so we can also to some extent study second generation migrants in this data. And I want to show you this plot where we compare the employment gaps first generation and the employment gaps for second generation migrants. So second generation migrant here are defined as children who were born in Germany, but they had at least one of their parents came from one of these origin groups. And so what you see is so kind of this diagonal line here, this is, of course, this is the line that shows what would happen if there would be no improvements across generations. But most of these dots are to the left of the line, which means that on average, of course, we see. Okay, so for some groups, we had, for example, here for some of these Turkish groups, we had these massive employment gaps. And their children now, they do much better, right, compared to them. However, of course, almost all of these dots are still below the 0 line. So that means for all of these groups, we still see gaps to similarly aged adults. So that means these gaps shrink across generations, but they only shrink to some extent. If you want to have sort of the number, 25%. Okay, so the gaps that we had in the first generation, on average, shrink by about 25% in the second generation. I think another interesting, a bit more subtle point here is that the gaps also become more uniform across arrival years within origin. So what I mean by that, look, for example, at the Turkish migrants. Their employment outcomes here are vastly different depending by arrival year. And that partly reflects that they came under very different conditions, right? The guest workers, they really migrated into an employment contract, while some of the later arrivals, they came maybe as family reunification. So they had very different situation. But their children, they do all relatively similar, okay? Independent of when their parents. And of course, the last thing I think that we kind of already saw is there are strong intergenerational correlations in the sense that, yeah, for those groups where we had large gaps in the first generation, we will also tend to have large gaps in the second generation. Okay, so there's like a relatively clear pattern. So the gaps shrink, but kind of sort of the ordering between different groups remains relatively stable. Yeah.
So my question again relates to the experience of the US. We were talking about it. There is this very nice book by Leah Bustan and Rana Berminski, which is called Streets of Gold. And in this book, they show that both now and during the first globalization wave, first generation migrants to the United States did not assimilate completely, did not integrate completely, but the full catch-up took place during the second generation. And actually, oftentimes, the second generation of migrants more than catch up. They do even better than Americans coming from the same socioeconomic background. So here, clearly, the results are very different. And my impression is that in the European context, the experience of second generation migrants matters a lot for the narrative, the political narrative about migration. In the United States, notwithstanding all the debates that there are, there is an overall positive narrative about the idea of migration. So to what extent do you think the second generation matters? Of course, we saw that there are big differences in first generation migrants as well, but by the second generation, maybe there are also higher expectations.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one key difference, of course, is that the US experienced migration since a much longer time, right? For us, in many European countries, it's still a relatively new thing. That means we don't have so many clearly visible second, third, fourth generation migrants. So that means we don't have so many of these success stories, right? We do have some very, very nice success stories. And I think Germany is like for those who are German, I think like the BioNTech example is like the primary example, right? Like the migrants from coming in, sort of having this wonderful innovation and very successful companies. But maybe we don't have so many of those stories as in the US, simply because there are not so many second, third, fourth generation migrants around. But as you said, even in the first generation, it's very different, right? The key difference with the US is also that, or one key difference is that we have these huge employment gaps, which of course are mirrored in welfare dependency. So if you look at what is the share of people in each group who are dependent on welfare, for some immigrant groups, it's very high. And again, this is very different to the US, where the employment rates are. So I think it's multiple things. It's not having this, more visibility of these successful second, third generation migrants, but also already in the first generation, things are very different. But it probably shapes the narrative in some way. Yeah, great. Okay, so yeah, so that was kind of a bit first, second generation migrant comparison. Of course, one could go a lot deeper, but today I want to give you more like an overview. So let's move on. So the next question I want to ask is, okay, how predictable are all these differences in integration outcomes, right? We saw that different groups are doing very differently. And so one question you might ask is, if like a new group arrives, is it kind of, can we kind of guess how well that particular group is doing? And I think the short answer is that, yes, to some extent, it's quite predictable. If I say predictable, you might ask, okay, predictive based on what? So the first thing we show is that, which I think is interesting, is that if you look at individual outcomes, like how well they're doing in terms of employment, income, and so on, of course, the most natural thing to do would be to relate individual outcomes to individual level characteristics, right? You might ask, okay, what's the education of a person? What's kind of age, other demographic information of that person? But one thing we do in the paper is to show that actually cohort level characteristics are at least or more predictive than individual level predictors. Okay, so if I pick a particular migrant and I want to know how well that migrant is going to do, yes, I can ask what is that migrant's education, but I can also ask what is the average education of the group that this migrant belongs to, like the origin and arrival group. And it turns out that these average characteristics are often more predictive how well an individual is doing than the individual's own characteristics. Yeah. 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 Right, exactly. Yeah. 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 Hmm. Yeah. 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 Different waves being very different. Exactly. I get you on. Exactly. Yeah. So here, I mean, what I have on slide and what I'm telling you is it's all about these average cohort outcomes. We are kind of completely abstracting from the variation within cohorts. So it's a good question to ask about it. And you're right. I mean, what we find here that also these cohort level averages, that they're so predictive, it might be suggestive that maybe there's not that much variation within each of these cohorts. And one reason is indeed that for some of these waves, I think they were fairly homogeneous in terms of their background characteristics. So for example, the guest workers, they would come often from certain regions that were not the most highly educated. And so there might be reasons why certain cohorts come with certain characteristics on average. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, I got it. Yeah. 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 Exactly. Yeah, exactly. We could maybe look at cohort groups that had more variation within the group and then where there's less variation and then see whether these results change. I agree. Yeah, no, that's a good idea. Thanks. Yeah, so what we show in a nutshell then is here, if you know very basic things about a cohort, such as the average education or the share of refugees in the cohort, you can explain about 75% of the variation that I showed. Okay, like we have these different profiles for different groups and employment and income. If you want to look at that in terms of a regression, but you don't have to. So those of you who like to look at regression results, what we will be interested in here are these R squares. So this is a measure of how much of the variation in the outcome of interest, for example, the employment gaps or the income gaps, how much of that can be explained with these cohort characteristics? And the answer is that if we take a couple of those cohort characteristics, we explain about 75 or even 80% of the gaps. Okay, so this is to say, sorry, this was initial gaps. This is spontaneous after arrival. So what we're saying here is that if you know some very basic things about immigrant arrivals, about those cohorts, it's fairly easy to predict how well they're doing on the labor market. Historically, of course, if you now take this and you kind of try to forecast the future, that's always risky. I'm going to do it at the end of today's talk. And then in 5 years, you're going to tell me that everything I said was completely wrong because the forecasts went completely off. But at least historically, it's very systematic which groups are doing well or not, and like with very simple information you can predict that. Okay, second question. Let me first ask, how are you doing on time before I? Okay, then we're good. So the second question you might ask is, okay, have integration outcomes systematically improved or not over time? And so I think I want to show you just sort of this one graph here. These are the same employment gaps that we saw earlier, now measured 10 years after arrival. Okay, so previously I showed you these pictures where we looked at the entire life cycle for the migrant. Now let's focus on how well are different immigrants doing 10 years after they arrived in Germany. And we're going to look at that over time. Sorry, the title of the x-axis here not ideal. And so it's the same groups as before. And so the blue line and these solid dots, these are what we call unconditional observations. So this is really just comparing immigrants and natives of the same age. The the hollow dots. Now we have a missing font. The hollow dots and this dashed line. This is a conditional comparison where we compare immigrants and natives of the same education. Okay, so we're kind of trying to control a bit for the composition of different cohorts. Okay, so of course, if a cohort comes in of migrants who have very low education, sure, that affects their employment outcomes, and we can kind of control for that, for these compositional changes over time. So unconditionally, if you just look at the raw gaps, things have worsened a lot, right? That's kind of this time trend, the solid line. We see that in employment gaps, they have increased by about, I have the table here, by about 5 percentage points each decade. Okay, so they went basically from 0 to 20, 25% gaps that we see more recently. Of course, part of the reason why that is the case is, well, the guest workers did relatively well, at least initially. Not surprisingly, because they basically migrated into an employment contract, right? So it's maybe a bit mechanical that they did well. But some of these, and then we sort of see this large things really worsening kind of in the early 90s, late 90s. Okay, so then we started having groups that did really badly on the labor market, and that is still the case for many more recent arrivals. If you control for education, so this is now the dashed line, this becomes pretty flat, actually, which is to say that, yes, integration outcomes have worsened a lot, but most of that is just composition. It's in some sense not surprising because many of the groups who came in more recently have relatively low education, they have high refugee shares, and we know that cohorts with less education and higher refugee shares will tend to be worse. Okay, so our summary here is, yes, integration outcomes have worsened a lot, but it's mostly because the composition of migrants has changed a lot. Okay, so what I want to spend sort of the last 5-6 minutes on is sort of kind of these case studies. The one I want to just show you very briefly, which we call, we try to pick a dramatic name to get the readers interested. We call it kind of this 1990s employment collapse. And so you saw that a little bit earlier when we talked, for example, about some of these Turkish cohorts. Sorry, now I'm jumping a lot. That seem to suddenly do a lot worse. Let's look at that again, but let's this time at the x-axis. I'm not going to have years since migration, but let me put on the x-axis just the year of observation. Okay, so if we do that, then this is the picture we get. So these are the actual gap between these Turkish arrivals that came in the 50s and 60s and similarly aged natives. And so we see that the gap was relatively small initially. We get used to this. And then something happened, right? And so what we do in this graph is we talk about this age component. Like the first time we saw this, we thought, okay, maybe it's just age. Maybe these migrants now in the 90s, they may be reaching 50s, 60s. Maybe some of them go into early retirement. Maybe it's just that they go to retirement earlier than the natives. But we control for that. That's this red line, and it's not that. Okay, so it's not an age effect, it's a time effect. Something has happened in the early 90s that was really terrible for these migrants in Turkey. And so I'm not going to go into details now, but what we do in the paper, we do different things. And one takeaway is that, yeah, it really had a lot to do with industry structure. They were unlucky to be in these industries that did really badly in the early 90s. And for some reason, even though the same happened to Italian and to Spanish migrants, for some reason, for Turkish migrants, they basically remained unemployed. Okay, so they did not find back into the labor market after being exposed to these industry-specific shocks. And so you see, that's why we call it dramatic, because it is really 25 percentage points, right? This is really basically a complete large chunk of those cohorts became unemployed and never found employment in the space of a couple of years. Okay, the last thing I want to do is let's talk about recent arrivals. So maybe we can use what we learned about the past and think about a bit more about recent groups, right? Just kind of think about what we might expect. And so what we do here is, and I use the word forecast, as I said, it's always a bit risky. Let's look at what might happen to the kind of large number of refugees who arrived in around 2015. And let's look at maybe what we should expect for Ukrainian refugees, right? Okay. So there's some details about the data we use and the assumptions we use and so on, but let me just show you what we get. So on the left side, we have the 2015 arrivals after the Arab Spring from Syria, from other countries. And so for those groups, we also have some information on how well they actually did, because they have been now in the country for a couple of years. And that's the green line, right? So with the green line is the gap in employment rates between these refugee cohorts and native Germans of similar age. And so what you see is, again, it's kind of this typical concave profile, right? So of course they had very low employment rates in the beginning, but they increasingly do better over time. So we see convergence. But if we take what we learned in the past, how these profiles usually look like for people with similar education and or refugees with similar education, then what we would expect to happen is this orange line. And so what you see is that, and that's of course one reason why I'm showing it to you, is that, yeah, what's happening is quite in line with what you would expect from the past. This is, again, it's kind of this point that to some extent it's quite predictable, the patterns. Now I said the orange line, you might ask, well, actually two orange lines. So what's the difference between the two orange lines? Well, one thing that's interesting to keep in mind is that in around 2015, the labor market conditions in Germany were actually really favorable. We had record low rates of unemployment. And if you take that into account, then this shifts a little bit of what you would have expected. So here, the dashed line with these short dashes, this is taking into account that we had really favorable condition on the labor market around 2015. And so if that's your comparison point, then the sort of 2015 cohort, they're actually doing a little bit worse than we would have expected based on the past. Okay, so this is to say, yes, kind of what we see lines up with what we saw in the past. Maybe they're doing a little bit worse than what we saw for comparable groups in the past. You might ask, why did they worse? I don't know. In this paper, we don't study that. One idea is, of course, maybe it's just the sheer number of people who came in, right? If you have like 1 million people coming in at the same time, that's, of course, a lot more stress, potentially a lot more difficult to find employment than if smaller numbers come. What about the Ukrainians? So here we do the same exercise for the Ukrainians. There we don't have so much actual data yet on how well they're doing, although if you read the newspapers, you will find some reports. And this time we actually, for once, we do it both for men and women. And the reason is, of course, that, yeah, for Ukrainians, most who came in were actually women, right? They were not men. So doing the exercise only for men, for them is particularly strange. And so if you look at what you would expect to happen compared to natives, it's actually fairly favorable. We would, based on what we saw in the past, we would expect those groups to do well. Why is that? Well, those groups have quite high education. So the educational attainment of Ukrainian refugees who came in is much, much higher than some other refugee groups that we have. As said, this is a forecast. It might not turn out. And actually, if you do read the news, you will see that there are some reports that actually the employment rates are quite low for Ukrainian immigrants at the moment in Germany. Okay, so there's a bit of a puzzle because we would expect them to do relatively well. But from these early reports, that's not yet happening. Okay, I want to conclude. So I wanted to try to give you sort of a little bit this overview of integration outcomes in Germany over the last 50 years. we saw sort of like a few basic patterns. Yeah, we see convergence, employment, but for many groups, we have large gaps remaining. Income gaps actually widening over the life cycle. We saw this dramatic collapse of employment for some groups in the 1990s. So that means as sort of integration is not a one-way street. As a policymaker, you should remain on guard, so to say, about what happens to your migrant groups, even if for the moment things look okay. Labor market gaps close only partially in the second generation. And a lot of what we saw there is highly predictable. If you know very basic things about different cohort characteristics, you can predict relatively well how different cohorts are doing. And we use that to show you some of these forecasts. So what do we sort of, I don't want to just leave you with results. I want to leave you with a puzzle. So what's the puzzle? So the puzzle, after we've seen all of that for us, was that in the social science and economics, I think in the last decades, we've learned a lot about what helps migrants. We know a lot about how different integration policies work out. For example, in Germany now, we put a lot more emphasis on language training than we did 30 years ago. We have a much more permissive citizenship policy because we realize that if you offer migrants a way towards citizenship, that this can be really beneficial for their labor market outcomes. And so, there are all these good intentions and all this sort of evidence that should move policy in the right direction. But then if you look at sort of the big picture, we don't see any improvements, right? There's no systematic improvements in integration outcomes. It's still relatively poor, in particular in terms of employment. And so this puzzle, I want to, sorry for leaving sort of with a bit of a puzzle, but I think that's an interesting puzzle of what is going on, what can we do, what has to change. Okay, thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you very much, Jan. And I will open it up to questions. If you can tell us your name, where you're from, and your program, and then go ahead.
With the mic.
Yes, please.
Hello? Okay, cool. Hello, I'm Harrison. I'm a first-year MAIR student, and I have a first question, then a conditional one after that. So where was your data taken from? Was it the Federal Republic, or did you also get it from the Democratic Republic during the war?
Oh, yeah, I should have said that. This is West Germany, partly because we started in the 50s, 60s, and then we just kept on going with West Germany to keep it comparable. Yeah.
All right, now the conditional question. So given the fact that you didn't take data from East German immigrant groups, which often came from around the Warsaw Pact, how do you think that could confound your predictions with groups following 1991 and 1992? Do you think this will end up having an effect on how groups integrate based on, where you took your data from the West, considering the economic conditions are quite different?
Yeah, so I think it means that, of course, we are missing part of the picture. So there were certain groups in the East, for example, the Vietnamese, who were prominent. And so we don't have anything to say on them. I don't think it messes up the pictures that I showed you, because those immigrants that we had in the West, they didn't overlap much with immigrant groups that we had in the East. Okay, so for example, in the West, we had many Turkish migrants. There was not so much the case in the East. So there were different groups. And generally, there were, of course, much fewer foreigners in the East. So yeah, we are missing that part of the picture, but I think it doesn't change what we saw today. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for presenting your findings. My name is Massimo. I'm a first-year MAIA student here in Bologna. And I guess my question is a little bit more about the puzzle that you left us with at the end. And then maybe thinking about this my question directly is, do we think that integration policies need to take in more than just the economic well-being of migrants when they arrive in the country? And I think you've touched on this a little bit by talking about the need to learn a language and to then be integrated into that society. And my mind goes into thinking about maybe even seeing your findings and more about, like, where do these people live within the new host country that they're living in? For example, I think of this idea of the US having more of an assimilation policy, that you leave your culture for the US's new one rather than maybe integrating into one where you still keep your identity as a migrant, but then now living in, let's say, Germany with the Turkish example. But it'd be really interesting to see about where, because you mentioned that Turkish migrants tend to live within societies that are mostly Turkish. And I'm thinking about that also in like a Swedish context where they brought in a lot of refugees from, let's say, Kurdistan, who, like you said, then refugees then don't have the same economic benefits. But then they also lived in very segregated communities. And then we could see the social tensions that are happening now with the Kurdish population in Sweden. So I'm just thinking about, like, how do you design these integration policies to not only just make sure that people have a paying job?
Yeah, so exactly. How should we design integration policies? So I don't know the answer, but let me give you some ideas. You mentioned language. I think that's something that people realize is very important, right? So that's one of the big differences to what Germany is doing nowadays, to what they've done in the past, is that now we put a lot of emphasis on language training because we realize that this is probably going to be important in the long run in many dimensions for migrants. And that is, of course, reflects that we kind of understood that migrants will tend to stay for long, right? When the guest workers came in, the idea was that they're going to stay for a couple of years. So as long as they speak enough German just to do their particular job, why do they need to learn German, so to say? And now sort of if you realize that migrants are going to stay for their entire life, then of course it's much more worth to really invest first a couple of years into language and so on. And so that is happening. And I think that's part of the puzzle. Why don't we see the benefits yet? One potential answer is that these policy changes are just too recent. I think another potential answer is that there's a problem of take-up. So there are some papers that we cite in our work saying the problem is maybe not so much what's on offer in terms of integration policy. The problem is that many of these offerings are not being taken up very well. So there are lots of good intentions, but maybe a lot of those policies are not reaching far enough. Regarding segregation and different communities, yeah, I think we don't have anything new to say on that in this project, but it's clearly a topic of interest in the literature, right? There are people working on trying to understand what's the effect of living sort of in your community from your host country. There are, of course, many potential benefits. They might help you in integrating in terms of learning what you have to do and finding jobs and so on. So we also, for example, there's some studies showing that depending on where you send refugees, they might have very different outcomes. So for example, if you send them to some rural areas where they don't have many networks, maybe that's actually a bad thing, right? So it can really go both ways. But on the other hand, we're also worried about some of these clusters where really people don't have interact much outside of their community. And yeah, I think there's a lot of interest in what to do about it. Of course, it's difficult what to do about it because if you don't want to really force people to live somewhere else. But that's indeed, for example, I know there's some policy experiments going on in Denmark. Denmark has a very aggressive immigration policy now. And they are, I think, really thinking about these type of policies, like to really break up neighborhoods, trying to get sort of break the segregation patterns. But of course, it's a very aggressive type of policies if you force people to live somewhere else. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, this first and then in the back.
Hi, thank you so much, Daria. I'm a first year Maya student. I actually think I saw a similar lecture by you a couple of years ago in the UK. So thanks so much.
Great.
My question relates to, you said in the 1990s there was this economic shock and that different migration cohorts were affected differently, so that especially the Turkish cohort had difficulty finding jobs afterwards. And you said that it was partly explained by a lot of the Italian and Spanish, or some of the Italian and Spanish community migrating back to the countries.
Yeah.
But the other part that's not explained by that, I was wondering what your prediction is, or if you found anything in the outcomes, why there was a difference. I think that could be interesting.
Why there was a difference in return migration? Why the Turkish didn't?
No.
Yeah.
Why not the difference in return, but for the people, the Spanish and the Italian cohort that stayed, why it was different for this cohort in relation to the Turkish cohort?
Why it was different?
Yeah.
I think the one reason, of course, was that at that time Spain, Italy did relatively better. So maybe going back from Germany to Spain and Italy was not such a big change in economic opportunities, while Turkey did relatively badly at that time. So the Turkish migrants maybe had an incentive to stay in Germany, even if they lost their job. Yeah.
And within the cohorts that stayed, did you
Yeah.
see a difference there in how people manage to find jobs?
Yeah, in the sense that we see that those who stayed, the Italians and the Spanish, for example, they did much better than the Turkish. But part of that, it's hard to say. Part of that might be the selection, that it's a different selection of people who stayed for the Turkish as compared to the Italians and Spanish. Okay, so we do, for example, we see that as a cohort, as a group, the Italians and Spanish do much better. But maybe that's just because those who were unemployed went back home. Okay, so what would be really useful is to have individual level data to really follow people across country to be able to say something more direct on that. I think with this data, that's just what we have.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And there was a question in the back.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Michael. I'm a MAIR student. I was curious if you considered differences in access to the labor market in terms of changing laws over time and just permissibility of migrants versus refugees versus migrants who came in the 70s versus migrants in the 90s, the legal system and ability to work within Germany. Because obviously, as an American in Europe, you already can tell that it's difficult for us to get a job depending on the visa you have and the laws that have changed over time. So
Exactly. Yeah, no, that's clearly going to play a large role, right? Like how easy is it? Are you actually allowed to enter the labor market in the first place? And of course, refugees who arrived, they were often not allowed to enter the labor market until they were had their cases being heard. Yeah, I think that is, and I think that's a problem that now we have actually very good evidence, not in this paper, but other people are working on this question. Like, what's the effect of giving better legal rights to refugees, for example? And some of those recent papers, they have very good research designs. They have really evidence, causal evidence that's, I think, very reliable. And they sometimes find very large effects. So maybe not surprisingly, if you give, if you give immigrants better access to the labor market and also maybe put less red tape on what they're allowed to do or not, you will see apparently much better outcomes. And I think in Germany, policymakers know that. They, to some extent, some of the reforms we've seen, we are trying to give better labor market access to immigrants, because we know that this might play a big role. The problem with that is, of course, there's sort of this trade-off. There's this concern that if you give too easy access to the labor market, that this might make it also more attractive for more people to come in. I think that's one reason why we don't see more permissive policies in lots of questions, because there's sort of this trade-off between, on the one hand, you know that for the existing migrants who are already there, this might really improve the situation, but then policymakers are worried that this is going to bring in more migrants. And that's, I think, where we're kind of stuck in this discussion. Yeah.
I'm going to ask a question. What about undocumented migration? My sense is that in Germany, there is not as much undocumented migration as in the United States. And of course, undocumented migration raises some issues. Not everybody likes the idea that people come and work without documents, but at the same time, it provides easier access to the labor market for those who still don't have documents. So the fact that undocumented migrants can work in the
at least
informally,
the gray market, so to say, and that exactly, which in the US is an important consideration. It's like the group of undocumented migrants is very large, but then often they are still employed. Exactly, yeah, as you said, I think it's less of an issue in Germany. For example, in the early 90s, there was a period where there was also a lot of undocumented migrants, partly because there was so much pressure from Eastern European countries. And at that time, it was still difficult to go from an Eastern European country to Germany. In the data we are using, they in principle should be contained in there, because this is survey data. So in principle, they should ask everyone, in contrast to administrative data, they should ask everyone, documented and undocumented. Of course, there's still some concern. Maybe the undocumented migrants are less likely to answer these type of surveys. So there's a bit of a concern that we might be undercounting some of the undocumented migrants. We can't split it up. We don't have a question in the data. We're saying I'm an undocumented migrant. But yeah.
But it could, to the extent that you capture them, it could explain some of the differences in employment rates, because some migrants in Germany who still don't have documents, they just cannot access the labor market. In the United States, they would be able to still work. And that the extent that they're captured in the statistics, you would see that they work.
Exactly. So I see a point. You're saying in Germany, like some groups are really more sharply excluded from the labor market because there are fewer options.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that plays a role in particular in the first years. I mean, of course, after you saw some of these patterns after 10, 15, 20 years, and there are these very persistent gaps. I think that's not about legal restrictions anymore. That's about just conditional on being allowed to work. It's not working out so well. Yeah.
Be that some specific cohort of immigrants did not integrate in Germany. And then you make this comparison with the United States. But I'm thinking that the comparison is not 100% correct, in the sense that US is a huge country. And if you end up arriving in LA, and then if there is a downturn in the economy in LA, you can easily move to another, to the Atlantic part of the state. So it's kind of easy. If you end up in Germany and there's a downturn in specific local labor market in Germany, then crossing the border to France is a little bit more complicated. So is it this kind of cross EU countries coordination immigration a source of lack of integration?
Germany is too small. There's no escape for labor market shocks. No, exactly. I think this could play a role. I think it might also play a role that it was really industry-wide downturns. It was not just something happened in a particular city in Germany and then you just go to the next city and do the same job. No, it was really entire industries doing really badly. And that actually we see even in the US, even though the US is so large. You probably know those papers, for example, on trade shocks in the US. There is evidence on that certain areas, like the Rust Belt in the US, as it's called, they also had these industry-wide shocks. And also there we see that workers in those areas, they did badly. So it was apparently not so easy for those workers to escape those shocks. Even though, and that's a puzzle, right? It's like, because it's a large country, I mean, you would think they just go somewhere else and then you recover. But it did not happen apparently, and so it did not happen for these Turkish migrants either in Germany.
So this is a synthetic panel, right? So related to this point, you're not able to get entry and exit over time. So I mean, exactly related to this. I mean, this is a curiosity again. To which extent do you think? I'm a big fan of synthetic panel. I use it in several papers. But one of the crucial part when you use a cohort fix effect, then you're somehow able to look at variations. Here, if you look along trends, in particular in a migration setting, in which naturally speaking, you have the EU enlargement in between, so migrants could move. And then you have the two financial crises, actually three, because there's also the IT one. But I think a crucial point that here could be problematic is the fact that you're missing when people are going out and in, because these are repeated screenshots of the situation. So, I mean, this is.
No, I agree exactly. This is an important limitation of the estimate. So people going in is not a problem because we always know the arrival year. So, if new people are coming in, we are not accidentally mixing them up with the old people because we can split it up by arrival year. Sure. What is a problem is people going out. So basically, we are following these, as you said, synthetic cohorts. And of course, the composition changes over time because some of those initial arrivals might have left the country. And we don't know who exactly because it's not panel data. And so you're exactly right. So this affects interpretation. One thing we did is, I didn't show it today, but in the appendix, we have these figures for each cohort showing you just the size of the cohort. So for example, if the size of the cohort stays relatively constant, then you know that not so many people left. Okay, so then you know that it's not but of course, for some cohorts, indeed quite a lot of people left. For example, like the earlier guest workers from Turkey, from Italy or Spain. And then, so this affects interpretation of the estimates. I don't think it makes them necessarily less interesting. It just means that, for example, if we see, for example, employment outcomes improving, this could be either because the existing workers are finding employment at a higher rate, or it could be that those who didn't find employment maybe went back to their home country. These are different interpretations, but from a policy perspective, just knowing that employment outcomes improved is still kind of interesting, even though different mechanisms. Yeah.
Catching up.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, is it catching up, or is it that they're becoming more skilled and they're integrated in other ways? So I completely agree. It's a matter of interpretation in terms of policy.
Yeah.
Should I make them integrate more, or should I make them not leave? So
exactly. Then it starts mattering. Yeah,
exactly. So it's but
exactly. That's why in the one case where we really started digging to really say something on that is the case of this employment collapse in the 1990s, right? And there my co-author has another paper where he uses panel data to exactly look into that question. And that's why for those cohorts, we kind of know what happened because we had panel data. But you're right. I mean, you want to go into more details there, depending on what's your question and you have in mind. Yeah. Good.
So I'm going to ask a final question. And it is, aren't you a little bit too tough on yourself, in the sense that you're comparing these migrants at most controlling for education? But, there are many other characteristics of individuals that affect their success, economic and non-economic success. So, for example, for second-generation migrants, the income of parents. I wonder if you control for that, if you're going to find, again, this divergence.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's a matter of perspective. I mean, you're exactly right. Like many studies, they really do conditional analysis. You try to find migrants and natives who have very similar characteristics, maybe similar family background in terms of income, and then you see if there's still differences. And that's very interesting. For example, if you're interested in questions such as discrimination, you want to compare sort of apples to apples, and then you want to control for as much things in some sense as possible. Here, that's not the perspective that we have. So the perspective we have is more the one from a policymaker. If a certain migrant group does badly because they have very low education, for example, that's part of what we want to capture. We don't want to sort of explain that away. Yeah, that's the short answer. That's a long one.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the questions and comments and good applause.
Thanks for all the questions, including the very critical ones. Very good. Yeah.
No.